We're calling this next stage Indigo, which is not to be confused with, but pertains to the psychic state of awareness. The word psychic requires some unpacking because you'll immediately be thinking of the green via magenta psychic phenomenon and various problematic usages there. At this point in the model, when we get into the third tier, we're getting into a territory that is more disputed. Not so much that these structures are debated as to whether they exist, but more whether they belong in this model. So spiral dynamics, Claire Graves never include these top 4 altitudes. We are not talking about people who have telekinesis or the ability to tell the future or can pull miracles somehow. If that happens, that might go here. But in all likelihood, we're talking about something very different from that, which has more to do with perception of hidden layers of reality or perceptions of extremely subtle facts or subtle sensations, intuited realities, hidden realities, esoteric realities, greater awareness of that which is unstated and that which is taboo even. This is the point where altitudes differs most from spiral dynamics and a lot of other models, and that is the inclusion of what you could consider to be Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga stages. And it's not only from there, and it's not exclusively from there, but that's a good place to go and try to figure out where these come from. And here we get into a lot of new and confusing terminology. So first of all, as I said, in turquoise becomes interested in states of consciousness, and I didn't really explain what that means. So states of consciousness, happiness, sadness, depression, right? States, okay. You feel lucky one day, okay, but also personas. So when you're at work, when you're acting professional, you might have one sort of persona that you do. When you're in a relationship, you might pull out several different personas, or when you're with your family, and these may even sort of conflict with each other at times. So these are states as well, different kinds of states correlating to different parts of the self, personas, ego, the body even. So if your body's in pain, you'll be in a particular state. So this is just like it sounds, states of consciousness. Okay, but then state stages or state structures of consciousness, which is to say you can learn to get into a state of consciousness repeatedly and then habitually. One example of this would be affirmations. So in affirmation, the idea is you sort of enter a trance or hypnotic or just ordinary state. You tell yourself something that you want to believe. And then little by little, that is adopted into your actual psychological mindset and framework. And then you go about as though that were you. So that is adopting a state, which in this case is like a verbal state, a thought, into your actual structure of who you are, your own identity. And this is similar, but not exactly the same thing. In studying mystic traditions and religion, we do find altered states. So this is one of the most important things to understand if you're getting into meditation or getting into altered states, either way, is that meditation is a process of reaching states first as an awakening and then bringing those states back into your state outside of meditation. That those are both a part of it. So to enter the state is entering states, using meditation to access states, and you can use a lot of different methods to access a state. But another part of the practice is to be able to access that state in your normal waking life, in yourself, in the actual work that you do in your life. It's not a separate thing, it's not a hobby that you do, but you as a being in your career and in your relationships are manifesting your spiritual essence and an honest, genuine portrayal of yourself as the psychic being. So psychic not pertaining to mysticism so much. Psychic simply pertains to the psyche, being of the psyche, being psyche aware. Aware being apart from, so seeing the psyche from the self, from the center, from consciousness, being conscious of the psyche. And this will introduce us to archetypes and shadow, and we'll be entering a world where the self is much more rich and detailed. We now have to actually look at what we think we are and what we think we believe directly and experience it in order to understand our true nature. This is the path of meditation, the path of the yogi. as we experience these meditative states, they become more habitual. Just like if you drink, you get drunk, you get used to being drunk. It becomes habitual. Addictions, compulsions of the mind, inebriants, all of this is part of your chemical makeup and your mental makeup and your psychological makeup. You're used to things. You have habits. As we move on into the third tier altitudes, these all represent certain forms of transformations and purifications of those sorts of habits in the lifestyle, because we don't find ourselves in a truly rational, objective perspective right now. We find ourselves at the altitude that we're at with a lot of fictional constructs in our foundation. A person can get used to anything, and we're reminded of Stockholm Syndrome as well. So this is the idea of consensus reality. You're used to things right now. You're used to certain ways of responding emotionally, mentally, just like in Stockholm Syndrome. At first, you might be shocked and respond against abuse, but over time, it may become habitual, and you'll learn a pattern of responses that will shut down your emotional abilities and your intellect and your capacity to relate to others. As we move into the third tier in Indigo and higher, we become very interested from a lot of different frameworks and a lot of different traditions and perspectives. There will be this interest in finding states of consciousness and then transforming them into long-term structures. We're just trying to categorize all this stuff right now because there's so little work and so little transparency on these models, which are almost the great chain of being. They're almost classical in nature. They're almost traditions themselves. The problem of the model is that almost all models end around the teal or turquoise stages. Almost all models end there and don't see anything further because people don't group higher than that, sure. But in Wilbur's model, based upon spiritual practice, Buddhist traditions, and the work of Sri Aurobindo and his integral yoga, he sort of takes stages that are recognized across various traditions and places them on top of the spiral dynamics model to create what I'm calling altitudes here. Essentially, the third tier is this series of structure stages that reveal themselves through the practice of meditation or other practices. Wilbur and myself, coming from Zen meditation practice, describing them largely in those terms, with also being a Western American, very familiar with Christian, Judeo-Christian ideology as well and ideation. But it can be applied to any large, major religion, anything that has the same sort of backbone. So the question is not so much whether these exist, but whether they belong on the same model with a model of what we could call growing up or a developmental model for the human being and human society. Does that then go on into spiritual awareness? Even though we can say for sure people can develop to having these higher states and increasing ability in these higher states, it's a little more dicey to say this is the same map with them both on top of each other. This is something that Wilbur draws attention to as a metaphysical problem. So with that in mind, you can either do it like that, or you can consider it a horizontal, another directionality. The levels of spirituality could go as you're growing up through these altitudes. You may also be waking up through these structure stages of consciousness, from gross to psychic, subtle, causal, non-dual. That those can occur simultaneously, but it's not as simple as that either. And I don't really want to get into that as much here in just describing the altitudes, because that is another video describing the unfolding of meditation, brainwaves, and states, structure stages. So it's a lot to get into. So here we're only talking about Indigo. And regardless of the particular reality of how these stack together, altitudes, structure stages, it's important to recognize these certainly exist. Growing up certainly is a thing that is documented in psychology, social sciences. Waking up is certainly the fact of the matter when we're talking about meditation and religion and spirituality and trying to form some sort of grand thesis of what the enlightened or Christ consciousness or cosmic state of awareness, what that peak state is, what this sublime divine state, if it exists, what category does it belong to? This is a great map of that, and good luck finding another map of that makes any sense whatsoever. So this is an extremely valuable map, regardless of whether you want to agree or disagree with the idea that the evolution of man, the evolution of yourself, can only proceed forward into deepening your awareness of all the layers of yourself and your unconscious and that which is on the other side of your ego, your waking conscious mind. I still think that's up in the air and debatable, and of course it is, so we will continue. the only other solution being to go with religious traditions, which are going to be dogmatic and exclusive and have a lot of frilly, mythical, magical nonsense packed in with them that you don't necessarily want if you're not a member of that culture and you don't have any utility for it. The structure stage anatomy is totally compatible with a scientific rational worldview. It does not require the use of a mythical system. It's just that the mythical systems have produced the best modes to date because the rational is so afraid of the transrational, and the rational is so avoidant of states of consciousness. It believes itself to be in a objective state of consciousness, which is silly. You could even get into like the near-death experience, what occurs when a person's near-death, what's happening in their brain, in their phenomenological perspective, what's really going on. Is there a realm that they're going to? Is there a state that they're going to? Is that a state that you can enter outside of a crisis situation? But it does bear mentioning that the meditative state stages are not the only state stages that we're familiar with. In fact, that's a large reason for the stacking of the models. All of the altitudes are structure stages. They occurred in individuals, and then parts of them became memes, popular memes, memeplexes, and those became standard structures of consciousness. So the changing of states into structure stages through meditation is a similar process as the intellectual unfoldment of growing up altitudes.